Okay, what is the law of Christ? Simply put, the law of Christ is to love your neighbor as yourself, as stated in Galatians 5:14. The phrase, the law of Christ, only appears once in the Bible, which is in Galatians 6. Now, many texts, including in Romans and Galatians, note that we're freed from the law of Moses, including all of the moral statutes like thou shalt not covet. For instance, in Romans 7:6-7, it says we're free from the law, and the next verse it says the law points out the sin to lust because it says thou shalt not covet. So obviously the law we're freed from includes the moral commandments as well. Now this means that even if we break those commandments, we're not held under the law's condemnatory sentence of hell. Thus, we do not have to keep the law of Moses or the law of God, same thing, for salvation. Although we still ought to keep the law in our walk as Christians because the law is inherently good. That's what Paul says in Romans 7. However, some like to dichotomize between the law of Moses and the law of Christ, proposing that while the law of Moses was done away with, we do have to keep the law of Christ for salvation or end up in hell as a consequence. So to them, that law of Christ includes all or the majority of the same moral commandments as the law of Moses, like loving your neighbor, not lying, not coveting, not stealing, not committing adultery, not murdering. So this effectively eliminates the force of being free from the law of Moses and its condemnation. It undermines the idea that we're all sinners, Romans 3:20-23, who break God's law and puts us back under the majority of the law of Moses for salvation. The same law of Moses that condemned us in the first place, the same law that no flesh will be justified by because by the law is the knowledge of sin, Romans 3:20, that same law is being proposed as required for salvation. That doesn't make sense. Not only is that an illogical proposal, but there is scant evidence to make that distinction. The mere singular mention of the phrase the law of Christ doesn't somehow then prove that keeping this law is required for salvation, distinct from the prior law that the Bible spends a lot of time refuting its association with justification and salvation. Other texts would need to clearly support this distinction in laws and the mandate to keep that new law. Yet the Bible never actually dichotomizes between the law of Moses, which is the law of God, and the law of Christ in this way. Throughout Romans, Paul just references the law, singular. In the Greek, sometimes it has an article, sometimes it doesn't. But even in Greek, anarthrous or article-less nouns can also be definite. So it's not like English where you need the definite article. And in his argument, he's only consistently referring to one law if you read the context throughout. I did a debate on this topic if you're interested. But there's only one singular law being referenced throughout Romans, hence the translators always just translate it as the law, singular. The same law Paul says we're not under for justification is the same law that Paul says we establish and ought to keep as Christians in Romans 3:31, right after saying we're justified by faith apart from the deeds of the law, and in Romans 13:8-10, where he tells them to love their neighbor as their self, where he just spent chapter 9, 10, and 11 saying we're not justified by the law. Now this only makes sense if it's the same law. While the ceremonial statutes were indeed done away with, like circumcision and Sabbath keeping, but you can still keep them in your walk if you want to, they were shadows of Christ. But we should still keep the law of God, which is the law of Moses, because it is inherently good. The law of Moses isn't some evil or irrelevant thing, Romans 7. It describes God's moral standard. James says we should keep the law in James 2, and he cited the 10 Commandments and loving your neighbor as according to the Scriptures. That's Moses' law. He's not citing a new law. In fact, in Galatians 5:1-3, the same law Paul says we're not justified by is the law in context he tells us to keep by loving our neighbor, not to be justified but to profit others. The law of Christ in chapter 6 is the same law in chapter 5 verse 14 because carrying another's burdens is loving one another. So this law of Christ is undistinguished from the prior law that Paul had just discussed for 4 chapters saying it doesn't justify. Matthew 22:36-40 also displays this, and it says that this is the law, which the first century Jews would have understood as the law of Moses. All the commandments hang under the great commandment to love others and love God, which is echoed as the law of Christ by Paul. Romans 6:15 also implies that the same law we aren't under for justification is the same law that we should keep, Paul rhetorically asks, he says, should we sin? Should we break the law? Sin is breaking the law. Should we break the law because we're not under the law? No, we shouldn't. His answer is no. So this implies we shouldn't break the law, the same law that we're not under. Now, if this law is merely the law of Moses, that's the one we're not under, as distinguished from the law of Christ, Paul's moral imperative wouldn't make sense. We are meant to keep and therefore not break a different law from the one we're freed from under this other paradigm where people say they're distinct. So his statement there wouldn't make sense. We're supposed to keep the same law we're not under, not for salvation, but because it's a good law. Paul even calls the law good in Romans 7, also in 1 Timothy, after saying we're freed from it in verses 6 to 7. In verse 9, Paul says the commandment came and he died, referring to spiritual death. Just one commandment killed Paul, because we all fall short of God's standard. To then impose that same commandment to bring life is nonsensical. Now the law did change, it altered in the sense that some ceremonial statutes in the law were done away with. That's what Hebrews talks about. But the law itself did not get abolished or done away with. Jesus didn't come to abolish the law. It's the same law, but we can refer to it by different names to represent its new context and revelation. But the law of liberty, the royal law, James 2, the law of Christ, Galatians 6, the law of Moses, the law of God, are not different laws. It's just the law. So in summary, we don't have to keep the law to be saved, and it can no longer send us to hell. But the law has always been a useful guide on how to live moral lives. And there's no difference, arbitrary difference, where people try to say the law of Christ must be kept, but the law of Moses is distinct in Romans. Once someone concedes that the law we're not under in Romans and Galatians includes the moral commandments, the conclusion is very clear. He's telling you that you're not under the law, including its moral commandments. To then impose those same moral commandments on a person to keep for salvation isn't consistent with Paul's argument.